You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, well, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Mansell.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
And as usual, as is mostly the case, we are your hosts for this show. So tonight, I think we got a really cool topic going here. We teased it a little bit last time, and if you check the Discord, hopefully you guys, look, the link is in the description. You should really join our Discord because that's going to be the hub for this community. So when we're not live with you guys on Monday and Friday, we're in there doing all kinds of stuff. I just actually shared a bunch of humorous memes in the, I think I just called it humorous meme section. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't that clever, but we actually announced, and I think we put this in the YouTube announcements as well, the next, I don't know, like 4 or 5 shows that we're actually kicking off today, which is basically, was George Lucas right about the midichlorians thing? And this came about because I remember I was talking to you about this not too long ago, actually. I think it was in the last week that I might have sent it to you, where I'm kind of like, hey, I ran across this article, and I may have changed my mind about midichlorians. Like, I think I understand. And basically what this is all stemming from is there was this interview done with George Lucas by Paul Duncan for like the Star Wars Encyclopedia thing or something. And it was like the 95 to 2005 or something like that. And already we actually got a chat from Chase Hedges, who basically says George Lucas knew what he was doing. And yeah, that's somewhat the conclusion that I'm coming to, is that when I was exploring it, okay, so first of all, let me back up, because I think, am I wrong that you hated the whole midichlorians thing too from the very beginning?
Yeah, I didn't. Well, I think I hated it for a different. Well,
it's like a multi-headed thing, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like a whole Hydra thing,
right? Exactly. It's like we all have reasons for hating this, but
I think I hated it because I didn't think it was necessary to bring it in. Like, the concept of it, I mean, I get it, makes sense to me. I just didn't think it was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint, my problem with the whole thing was from the very beginning. It's like, look, it just seemed to me that it was bringing Star Wars more into science fiction rather than science fantasy. I always felt that Obi-Wan's explanation in Episode 4, the Force surrounds us, it binds us, it's through all living things, it's, all this stuff. I always thought that was just sufficient. Broad strokes. Fantasy as a genre is all about broad strokes. And I thought that was sufficient, and that it gave the viewer everything that we really needed to know. So from my standpoint, I was like, I just think the midichlorian thing, now you're trying to give it the scientific explanation almost. And yeah, I don't know. To me, it was just going too in-depth and too much detail, and we really didn't know. And now it turns out that part of that is because Lucas wasn't able to there's like a lot of deleted scenes, a lot of things that were going on that I don't think he was able to, just from the editing or whatever, I don't think he was able to fully articulate. It's almost like what we're going to go over today, which is basically this interview and what Lucas said, and why I'm like, okay, the concept's kind of cool. Maybe I'm going to change my mind about things. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe, as Chase Hedges says, Lucas did know what he was doing, right? Because we always give him all the credit in the world for being a master storyteller. So maybe in this case, hey, maybe he knew what he was doing. But I don't know. I still go back and forth on, do we really need all this information even so? So that's really where I think we're going to frame this whole discussion today. I think that, you guys certainly, we hope you start chatting in fast and furious. David would actually like that reference. Because honestly, I think that this is a really, really cool discussion. Because, the midichlorian thing was really one of the first things that began dividing the fan base. all the way back. And speak of the devil, David's with us now. He says, hello, gentlemen. It's Star Wars Day, TGIF. I listened to multiple explanations and still can't grab it with my hands. I vaguely get it. Well, David, you come, as usual, to the right place. We are going to be talking about, really, the whole midichlorian thing as, as Lucas did. But I have to say, we got to get this out of the way. At the beginning of the show, we'll probably announce it again at the end of the show. If you guys like this video and you actually like these kinds of discussions where you guys can participate and, like I said, with our Discord and all that, there's just all kinds of opportunities now. Hit that like button. Hit the subscribe button. If you're watching this on Twitch, follow us because it really helps. And if you want to go that extra mile, right? Like maybe you're like, these guys are really cool. I really want to help these guys out. You can support us with buymeacoffee.com. We got a couple of packages, $5 a month, $10 a month, $25 a month. You can see it includes some stuff. Help support the channel. You could do a one-time donation. It's totally cool. So that's going to be the end of that commercial, right? So like button, subscribe button, maybe, donate a little bit if you guys want to help us out. Well, let's get into this whole thing because I think, honestly, this is really where it's at. But let me get Daryl in there. I think that this is really something that when you go back and you see where Lucas was really coming from, it is powerful enough to maybe sway you like, okay, I understand what he was trying to do. But again, I think personally that he just, if he had framed it differently, like maybe if he had Qui-Gon put this as part of the monologue when he was explaining it to Anakin, I think it might have been a little bit better. So let's just do this from, I got the interview here. So,
well, before you start, let me ask you this question.
Okay.
What do you think is confused? Because I guess, and this probably goes to David, and maybe people even like David. What is what confused you about the explanation that was given? So we have to kind of start with the root of the problem, really.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a good point, actually. I mean, right. So, why you're talking about with the whole Qui-Gon speech, right? Like,
yeah,
from David's perspective. Now, David saw the prequels, right?
I believe so.
Well, if he didn't, that would explain why. I mean, you kind of have to see episode 1 if you're going to get this. I mean, that would explain why somebody was confused. I don't think anybody that's seen The Phantom Menace is confused about it.
Well, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is confused in the sense of the explanation of, like, because you just said, like, okay, maybe if Qui-Gon would have explained it the way George did in this interview, people would have understood it more. That's what I mean. Like,
all right, David said he
what
saw
do you
it.
think? Yeah. So what do you think about?
Oh, you mean why do I think that maybe people might be confused even if they saw Qui-Gon's explanation of it? Well, I mean, because he basically explained the basis of it, right? I mean, he said, look, we're going to give you this blood test. I mean, it's, we went from Obi-Wan's explanation in episode 4, right? Where it's like, okay, it surrounds us, it binds us, I mean, it flows through all living things. Of course, you pointed out that Yoda more or less continued that in Peter Griffin's
episode
with us.
5.
Hey, Peter. I mean, yeah, in episode 5, he just was more or less continuing down what Obi-Wan said. It was this very mystical kind of thing. To where all of a sudden you get to episode 1 and it's like, oh, hey, yeah, we're going to do this blood test on you. And, oh, look, you've got like 20,000 midichlorians or whatever. And it just, I mean, it just felt like, again, that was basically the basis of my problem. It was almost like you were trying to give a scientific explanation of the Force, which the reason why I think that maybe it was seen in a negative way by fans is because if you actually see, this is why I didn't want to get into this now, because I really wanted to start reading what Lucas said. It's
Oh,
going to be
okay.
hard for me to frame this around. I mean, I could do it, but it's going to be harder for me to do it. You open that door, you ask the question. I was going to read it, but no. But all right.
No, I have
It's
to.
like, all right, you know what? It's fine. I can do this before getting into it. It's no problem. But here's basically the thing, right? Let's just put it like this. The way that George finally explains it, it more or less marries the idea of the fantasy and the sci-fi. Whereas when you're just left with Qui-Gon's explanation as it is in episode 1, it's almost out of place. You know, it's almost like when we last left it. Now, again, there's another thing that you could do too, by the way. And this just popped into my head, actually. Being that was episode 1, you know, because again, we're seeing episode 1 long after we saw episode 4, right? But if you actually watch these in chronological order, I think it's a little bit less of an issue, because it starts out where you had this society. There's Jedi all over the place, all this other stuff. He's talking to another potential Jedi. It's like, hey, listen, this is, how we measure the Force in you, right? Whereas by the time it gets to episode 4, and Luke is essentially like this farm boy, and he's just being introduced, you know, you're not going to be like, okay, you just found out about the Force yesterday, and you're kind of confused or whatever. I'm not going to start going into midichlorians and all this other stuff, because there was no context for Luke. There's context with Anakin because the Jedi are plentiful, and, you know, they're still in the middle of that, hey, we're going to take you guys and train you as Jedi because you have so much midichlorians in your blood. Whereas by the time Luke, it's kind of like, okay, well, how do I explain this to somebody who, by the time Luke is alive, I mean, the Jedi are extinct, pretty much. Right? So, like, how are you gonna justify that? So from that standpoint, if you put this in universe, maybe it's not so jarring, if that answers the question.
Yeah, because okay, so I have the actual quote from the movie. So Anakin asked, he said, "Master, sir, I heard Yoda talk about midichlorians. I've been wondering, what are midichlorians?" Qui-Gon says, "Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells. They live inside me, yet inside your cells, yes, and we are symbiotes with them." Symbiotes, life forms living together for a mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. So, based upon that conversation, I can see why there's a part, and I'm sure we're going to get as we get into the interview, but like the part that gets the confusing is life forms living together for a mutual advantage. Without the midichlorians, life cannot exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force. They continually speak to us, telling us the will of the Force. That part I can understand would be a bit confusing.
Well, it's a little wonky.
Because,
and again, kind of like you said, you know, with the interview part, that's what I mean, by the way, by it didn't go far enough. Because honestly, you know, the way Lucas explains it to this Paul Duncan guy, that could have just been like that's better than the scripted version. You know, you might as well have just, like, why couldn't a Qui-Gon said that? It's like, dude, you wrote this, right? I mean, Lucas wrote it, directed. It's like, why couldn't you just have him say that? Let me see, Peter Griffin.
Well, we all know Lucas is not really good for dialogue, though. So
no, I know. Let's get through a couple of these things. You know, our buddy Bruce on Twitter. Hello, head to head. Hey, what's going on? Yeah, Twitch. What did I say? Twitter. I always do that. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Of course, Peter Griffin says hello, and then Peter Griffin also says, "I had 1 midichlorians. The Force is strong in me." Yeah, well, as you'll see, it gets a little bit crazy, because this is the thing, you know. Again, midichlorians, that was sort of the hot topic, and I think a lot of it is because, again, you were correct in the sense of if Lucas had just explained it the way he did in this interview, I think people would have had less than a problem. But I honestly think that one of the biggest problems comes from the fact that we were at this point, we were living like 22 years or something with this generalized, more fantasy leaning explanation of the Force, and now we're getting a little bit into the sci-fi territory, and that's where I think he gets a little bumpy, because in some cases, and even though the time period of the prequels sort of lends itself to it, I think one of the big issues is the fact that at that time, I think Lucas was trying to really walk that line between sci-fi and fantasy instead of just being a sci-fi fantasy.
I don't know, though. I mean,
oh, it's head-to-head tonight.
Yes, it is. I used to think that, honestly. I mean, Daryl once thought that you do.
Oh boy.
but I started to kind of look at it as like, okay, contextually speaking, like you said, and if you look at Anakin, he's living in a time where, okay, Jedi are plentiful, they're all over the place. When you get to Luke, and the reason Luke is older, number one. And then, so I think Obi-Wan's explanation was like, okay, I just need to give you what you need because you have a job to do right now. And so I think contextually, Obi-Wan is kind of like, oh, the Force. He was like, oh, it's the energy field that,
well, that could be too. I mean, that
so
could be too. It's like, look, we got to get to Alderaan, man. I don't really have time to sit there and, get a PowerPoint out and, just start start doing this whole presentation, right?
I think that's where, and then with Luke, he already knew who, like Luke. I mean, Obi-Wan already knew, of course, who Luke was.
Right.
So he was like, okay, I don't have, whereas you got to think about it. Qui-Gon stumbled upon Anakin.
Yeah.
So he's kind of like, okay, this kid is insanely powerful or receptive to the Force. This is weird because one, why don't we know about him? Because at that time, remember, they were still collecting children to become Padawans. So I could understand why Qui-Gon did the whole blood test and all this stuff, because it made sense in context, because you look at it of their process of finding out who was going to be a Jedi or who had the potential to become a Jedi.
Come to find out, though, that what Lucas is saying is that they all get this blood test. Like, anybody gets this blood test. Because that's what he was saying. That's what Lucas basically says in this interview. So pretty much what he's saying is like, look, well, I mean, because the thing is, like, it starts out, he's like, midichlorians are the equivalent of mitochondria in living organisms and photosynthesis in plants. I simply combine them for easier consumption by the viewer. Mitochondria create the chemical energy that turns one cell into two cells. I like to think that there is a unified reality to life and that it exists everywhere in the universe and that it controls things. But you can also control it. And then he goes on to talk about this whole, like, personal force and cosmic force. He's like, the personal force is the energy field created by ourselves interacting and doing things while we are alive. And then when we die, we lose our persona and our energy is assimilated into the cosmic force. If we have enough midichlorians in our body, we can have a certain amount of control over our personal force and learn how to use it. Like the Buddhist practice of being able to walk on hot coals. The Jedi will train you to connect to your personal force and then connect to the cosmic force. You don't have much power to control the cosmic force, but you can make use of it. And, he goes on to, explain the wills, which, maybe we'll get into that in another show. But he goes, I know this kind of thing that fans just go berserk over because they say, we want it to be mysterious and magical, and you're just doing science. And he says, well, this isn't science. This is just as mythological as anything else in Star Wars. It sounds more scientific, but it's fiction. It's saying there's a big symbiotic relationship to create life and to create the Force. But if you look at all the life forms in the Force, most of them are one-celled organisms. I think of one-celled organisms as an advanced form of life because they've been able to travel through the universe. They have their own spaceships, those meteorites that we get to every once in a while, and he goes on. And so basically what he's kind of saying, and I've seen a couple of different breakdowns, and I've also read other quotes from this interview because I was only able to capture a little bit on my phone. But I went ahead and I actually tried to find other pieces of this interview, because if you actually want the whole interview, it's like in this Star Wars encyclopedia thing or something. So Lucas basically is kind of saying that the midichlorians are sort of like photoreceptors, like in a solar cell, right? So the more you have, the more sensors that the Force can hit. So the more ability you have. And then what essentially the Jedi are looking for is kind of like a number. Like it's almost like one of those, you must be this tall to ride this ride kind of thing. It's like the Jedi look, and if you have, obviously first they're saying, hey, this kid's exhibiting a little bit of a Force ability. We should check into this. And so they test them, and then whatever the random number is, let's just say it's like 2,500 or something. It's kind of like if you have at least 2,500 midichlorian, then you can be trained to be a Jedi. Because let's face it, anybody can learn to play an instrument, let's say. But, if you want to be a professional musician, you have to possess a certain amount of the ability, right? Like Watto, I'm sure, being that he probably has, I don't know, maybe he has a little bit more than our friend Peter here. Maybe, let's just say he has 3 midichlorians instead of 1, right? All right. Maybe after like 40, 50 years of training in the Jedi Temple under all these grandmasters, he might be able to force push a tissue or something. Because again, he just doesn't have, it's almost like you can look at it like cameras too. The bigger the sensor is in a camera, the more light that can hit it, the better, you could process that into an image, a better image. And of course, more light capabilities. So that's pretty much the whole thing. And when you put it in that, in that whole lens, I guess, and then of course, what Lucas just said in his interview, I can kind of see, because then that begins to make sense why the Jedi just aren't taking these random kids. Because again, you bring sports up all the time, especially basketball, like with Michael Jordan, right? You might have a bunch of people that are able to play basketball to varying degrees, but some might not go further than just being a really solid player, on a high school basketball team or maybe college, and then they go off. And then there's other people who exhibit immense talent. Well, imagine if there's a blood test for that.
Yeah. Exactly. That's how I always kind of looked at the Force anyway, as far as, especially when they brought in the whole midichlorian thing. I think the midichlorian thing is just a way to explain how or where the Force, I don't want to say comes from, because one part that, in the interview that he said, the Force is basically a metaphor for God.
Right.
So essentially, like, God lives in all things. And so certain people are able to sense, God's presence, essentially. And then people who study, like our religious leaders, like, whether you be a pastor, bishop, or whatever the case may be, whatever your religious affiliation may be, to your God, it's like, okay, the more you study, the more you learn about your God, like, okay, the closer you feel to it, the more you understand, the more you can do. And that's the same way with, the Force, essentially. And with the whole, I guess the reason that's what I was saying about the, when they're picking kids, it's, like everybody gets a blood test. It's like, well, the ones that they find, yeah, the ones that they feel like
Well, yeah,
are
again, they have to have some sort of,
reason
obviously, well, yeah, you have
pull
to,
you.
right.
Exactly.
They're almost like scouts in that sense. They
Yeah,
happen to notice
exactly.
these kids. right?
And that's a great example. Like when you said scouts, like for a sports team, you got scouts that go out and they go from schools and they're looking for talent. They're like, okay, hey, I heard about this kid, go check him out. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, yeah, this kid is amazing. We should kind of follow him. And a lot of times that's what scouts do. They see you, even in middle school, they're like, man, you have really good talent. You have great instincts. You have great vision on a football field. Okay, we can't offer you anything right now because you're too young, but we'll follow you. We'll keep an eye on you. So when you go to high school, when you get like maybe a junior, now we're really starting to pay attention to you because now
Right.
you're going getting ready to go to that next level. So I think that's pretty much what the Force and the whole midichlorian um, thing is. It's just really a way for George to explain to people how these folks are selected, more or less.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it makes when you put it in that context where it's more like the mitochondria type of a thing, or photosynthesis, where it's essentially what you're doing in simplistic terms is you're giving the Force a scientific way to act within the human body, and this is why some people can harness it because again, I mean, you can have a lot of natural, I mean, unless you're a prodigy or something. Even if you possess a
Mhm.
lot of natural raw talent, you still need coaching, you still need guidance, you still need somebody or something to shape you and mold you and help you achieve what your capabilities essentially, which of course is what the Jedi Temple does, right? They take,
Right.
okay, you rank so high on the midichlorian scale, which means you have, it's almost like an IQ thing in a way. It
Mhm.
really measures how much ability you have to connect with the Force. And now we're going to refine that and we're going to train you to be a Jedi Knight, which again, one of the things that I really should point out is Lucas never really intended Jedi Knights or Masters or just Jedi in general, really, to be like superheroes. And this is one of the things where I think that Disney sometimes is missing the mark. There's Lucasfilm under Disney is almost trying to make Jedi into superheroes in a way, where Lucas always imagined them kind of like, Buddhist monks or samurai or something, where they're just these like really skilled warriors, spiritual beings in a sense that become peacekeepers, which of course is what he built into the prequel trilogy
Mhm.
when he even had Mace said, we're keepers of the peace, not soldiers or whatever, so
Mhm.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a way to explain it, but here's the question. And this is what I would pose to you, and this is what I would pose to everybody in the audience. It's like, okay, well, that's a nice, neat explanation. But again, this is why I think a lot of the fans were complaining, is because it's one of those things that if you just kept it at Obi-Wan and Yoda's explanation, it would have been fine. You would have, you do have a little bit of mystery. Fantasy, like I said at the beginning of the show, is mostly broad strokes. Um, do you really think it was necessary to explain it? Did it really enhance the storyline in any way? That's the thing. Now, I should
Mhm.
point out that I did put a poll on, at least on YouTube. I should have done it on Twitch, but Bruce, I know you're still watching, so you can feel free to chat in your feelings on this. But I put a poll on it, and I said, look, I just put a statement and then allowed everybody to vote yes or no. I said, midichlorians are a good addition to the Star Wars universe. Surprisingly, 67% have said yes, and only 33% have said no. So that's one of those things that I think, of course, now we're at a point where Phantom Menace came out in '99. You've had an entire generation that have grown up with this too. So, the question becomes: is it really necessary?
um, I used to think no, but now I say yes. Here's why. Um, because I think what we got in A New Hope and Empire was an explanation of what the Force is. The midichlorian thing is more so like, okay, it explains almost kind of like what makes a Jedi, if that makes sense.
Or like how we connect, right? So
Or
like we
how
learn
or
how the Force is.
how
Now midichlorians explain how we connect to the Force, right? Is that what you're saying?
exactly.
Yeah.
More or less, yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's the important thing, because if you think about it, like, okay, because we're always talking about like, all right, the Skywalker lineage is like, okay, well, Anakin was born of the Force, Luke and Leia were, of course, grandchildren
Mhm.
of the Force, and then now, but so then now we look at somebody like Rey, and it's like, okay, well, how is she so freaking powerful? And it's like, oh, well, she's a Palpatine. It's like, well, and it all kind of makes sense, because when you're looking at like the whole scope of it all, Palpatine's always trying to create life. He's trying to preserve, Anakin is trying to save. Um, it explains the whole. I mean, if you really think about it, like it's kind of all science fiction, because you not science fiction, but science fantasy, but with a little bit of that in it, because look at the clones. I mean, that's science fiction if you want to be technical about some things. So I think a lot of it just gives you kind of a brief scientific explanation of how it works. So that way, because when
Well,
you look at it,
yeah.
if you look at it like the Force is like, okay, if you just leave the Force as, all right, well, why can't, if the Force lives, because Obi-Wan said it's in all living things, right? So that means everyone has the Force. So why can everybody, it's like, okay, if I'm just trained by these people, I can pick up stuff and choke people and move things around the room and see into the future. Is that the case? Because basically, if you just leave it at that, that's what that implies. But when
Well,
you
but
bring in
and
the
you could do
midichlorian
that.
thing,
You could very
well,
easily do that.
but see, my thing is like, but everyone doesn't have that ability, because it's like, okay, well, you have the ability to use the Force, but you may not have it. You don't have it to the ability where, let's say, if I won't even say Anakin, I'll just say take somebody like Obi-Wan. Like, let's say Obi-Wan had 12,000 midichlorians in his, body. Okay, well, it makes more sense that I'm gonna more or less sequester Obi-Wan to use the Force, because he has the greater potential of being able to use it. But if you got, like Peter said, one or three or five midichlorian receptors, it's kind of like, yeah, you could do it, but it's going to take you forever. It's like, it's almost like you don't have it.
Well,
You see
and
what I'm saying?
again,
Like,
yeah, I know what you're saying, because look, that's where I go back and forth, because the answer for me, spoiler alert, right, is that I could I could go either way, but you bring up the clones. Well, the clones are science fiction or whatever. Well, yeah, because again, the Force is the part that makes it fantasy, at least part of it, right? Because spaceships are science fiction. The Death Star is science fiction. It's
hmm
sci-fi fantasy. It basically goes along both of the things. You have elements of sci-fi, elements of fantasy. The elements that are
hmm
fantasy should just be left to fantasy. That's
yeah,
my point that I was trying to make, is that
okay,
when you have a like a multi-genre, type of a film, right? And I'm
hmm
not saying that necessarily things have to be necessarily compartmentalized either. Where it's kind of like you have to keep the sci-fi, and so you can, because look, I mean, you could argue that what they've done with lightsabers turned from pure science fiction to a little bit of fantasy, right? Because at first it's like, okay, well, you get these kyber crystals and you shoot this beam through. Very scientific. Well, until you get to the part that, you're bonding with your crystal and whatever. It's like a giant mood ring or something where, oh, you're feeling blue today. Look, I'm a blue lightsaber now, or I'm bleeding the thing, okay, now you're crossing over to fantasy. So that's a good example
well,
of
really, what the blue and the red is really Democrat Republican. That's really what that is.
exactly. It's like, why is my hilt shaped like an elephant? Oh, Ronaldo's here.
Exactly.
Ronaldo's saying, "What's up, Eric and Daryl? What's up, David?" Oh, and then David's got a chat, so we should address that one. Because I think he's still a little confused. He's like, midichlorian determines Jedi? Midichlorian is like your force power level, like on Dragon Ball Z? I'm kinda, right? I mean, yeah.
So, yeah, so David's a musician,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay, that's good to know.
So
David needs to be posting in the music part of our Discord. Just saying. Thought I'd throw that out there.
So just like most people, like, okay, some people have like the ear for music, like you can just hear music and you can just play it as you hear it. Some people have that skill set, but then other people, you have to be taught to have an ear, or you have to be taught how to do certain things. So, and that's essentially what we're saying, is that the midichlorians basically
What we're saying,
allows,
like you and Lucas, right?
well, I'm talking about you and I.
Well,
What we're saying is kind
I
of
know.
like,
I'm just teasing. Here, let me do this. There you go.
there you
Standing
go.
next to your boy there.
um
It'd be
what
like
we're saying
Super
is
Shadow
that-
pretty soon. I was having dinner with George Lucas the other day, and we were discussing midichlorians. Yeah, you guys might be Super Shadow might be for some of you guys this time.
Yeah. But the thing is that midichlorians basically are just saying, like, okay, like everybody's doesn't have the ability, like, a Flojo or Usain Bolt or whatever. Like some people just don't have the athletic prowess of a LeBron James or a Barry Sanders or something like that. And then there's people who you have to just train to do that. And so the midichlorians essentially are just saying, like, okay, you just have a natural aptitude for
Well,
something.
kind of. Actually, you're on the right track there. And again, so I don't necessarily disagree. Well, first of all, how could I disagree with what Lucas is saying, right? But I mean, the thing is, my only thing is, and again, and you guys jump in if you want, it's not that I have a problem with Lucas's explanation. In fact, Lucas's explanation, so at the beginning, I was like, okay, I hate this whole midichlorian concept. When the Phantom Menace came out, I thought it was stupid. I'm like, okay, this is dumb. It went from the Force binds us and surrounds us and it passes through life to, look, here's a blood test and, all this. I mean, it was a little strange to me. But when you factor in Lucas's explanation, it does make perfect sense. And it's not that I necessarily have a problem incorporating it. It's really more of a question of, is it really needed in the grand scheme of things? It's not. Sure, it perfectly explains it, because continuing on with your sports analogy, which is what I was alluding to when I said that, after 40 or 50 years in the Jedi Temple, Watto might be able to push a tissue or something, because he might have a really low midichlorian count. And it's true, you get people who are more naturally. Now, it's almost like you could teach anybody to play basketball, but there's only so good some people are going to be. It's not like the number of years of training means, okay, to be like a LeBron James, this guy only needed like 4 years of training. This other guy needs like 50, that kind of thing. It's not like that. It's like, look, you got to factor in, natural ability and genetics and, I mean, just all kinds of things. And that's what midichlorians pretty much put into the picture. It gives you that, like I compared it to a bunch of solar receptors. It's like if you just have one solar panel on your roof, it's not going to convert it as much electricity as if you have like 25 solar panels on your roof. The more panels you have for the sun to hit, the more energy you can collect. And that's basically what Lucas is saying in this interview. It's like, look, the more midichlorians that you have in your blood, the more receptors you have for the Force, and it increases. And that's why the Jedi look for people that have, I mean, we don't know what the number is. We've been throwing around like 2,500. But so let's just say it's 2,500. 2,500, and it's like, okay, this guy's got a lot of little receptors. And of course, before they even give him the blood test to find it out, they're seeing things. Or maybe people are reporting things to them. Because the idea is, during the height of the whole Jedi thing, they were looking for people actively. Like, it was practically like if you had a kid, a Jedi was coming to your house to see what was up. And I'm sure, I don't know. Sometimes they actually almost implied that they were basically infants. I mean, we saw that Tales of the Jedi thing where Ahsoka was like, like a little baby, and there were the Jedi ready to take her, But that's because there was a little bit of forceability there. And that's what leads the Jedi to find out, okay, well, let's see where they are on the midichlorian scale, and then on and on it goes. Ronaldo's got some chats. He basically says, I always thought if the midichlorians were explained in the first movie, people would have a different opinion. Well, that's essentially what you're saying. I know you had to join us a little later, but yeah. What we were basically saying is if Lucas's interview answer had been in the script for Qui-Gon to say, you probably wouldn't have had this much confusion or rebellion, if I may use that pun, because I think what happened was they only went so far with it and then dropped it, and it made it awkward. Where if you take the way that Lucas described it, I think fans would have probably gone in. He goes on to say, to be honest, in Clone Wars, the Jedi are very superhero-ish. Yeah, I know. Yeah, peacekeepers, but they fight villains and save people like heroes. I mean, that's true. But again, you also have to look at it from the standpoint of this, is that they themselves weren't really superheroes. What they were doing is they were doing superhero-like acts because Palpatine purposely maneuvered them into this war, knowing full well they're peacekeepers, knowing full well they can't sustain that. And that's why that Mace Windu line is in there in episode, was that 2? Or was that 3 that he said that? I think it was 2.
I believe it was 2.
Yeah, I do too. But I mean, that's the point, right? Is the fact that, and that's what Lucas is trying to say, is that, these guys were more or less peacekeepers, or like Buddhist monks, or like, they're basically just great warriors by nature of their powers and stuff. And that's something that even continued in the expanded universe.
Yeah, they're more like ambassadors for the government. They're pretty much going peacekeeping missions.
Yeah.
And they're really supposed to be using their powers more or less to solve, disputes because, the government can't be everywhere. So
right.
They kind of use the Jedi as ambassadors to kind of go, hey, look, you guys, let's come to some sort of an agreement. I'm using the Force to kind of see if you're lying or if you're trying to be sneaky, you're trying to hide something, to prevent this from happening. And if, some people need defending, because you have some people who are being tyrannical, then it's like, all right, then we'll step in and try to solve the thing as peacefully as we possibly can without having to draw our lightsabers or whatever, or have to use the Force or whatnot. And a lot of times people, when a Jedi showed up, they backed off because they knew, they knew that these guys had special abilities and they didn't want any parts of that. They didn't want that smoke, so to speak.
Well, and that's it. But they were never designed to be like generals and stuff like that. And that was something that Palpatine, I think, purposely maneuvered them into. And that's why the Clone Wars, you can't really count the Clone Wars because you have to remember the Jedi are a little bit out of their element. Now suddenly they're like these generals, and you're just kind of like, okay, I really don't know. What am I doing here, right? He goes on to say, I think they can work if you use them carefully. Meaning midichlorians. I think the setup in episode 1 missed the mark. It was very basic and added more questions than answers. Well, that's something, unfortunately, that Star Wars, with the exception of the original trilogy, that's what they excel at doing, is, creating more questions than answers. I mean, even right back from when A New Hope came out, you have to remember that back in 1977, when that thing was released, it was just called Star Wars. That's it. Star Wars, and then the crawl hit, right? Then it was re-released in theaters, like, I don't know, a year or two later. Maybe it was in 80. I remember we actually covered this in a show once. And I think it was when they re-released it in 1980, before Empire came out. Then all of a sudden, it had Episode 4, A New Hope. Now, you have to understand that us, who have already seen it, when it had nothing, we're like, well, wait a minute. What are you talking about? Where's episode 1, 2, and 3? You know, did I miss something? And that was because obviously that Lucas did that because episode 4 was the only one of the entire, at the time he had 9. This is before, Disney had created the sequel trilogy, all that. He originally had 9 episodes. I think actually he had originally 12, to be honest. And then he was going to cut it down to 9. But he felt that basically what you had was episode 4 was the only one that had more of a definitive beginning and end. So, yes, Star Wars has always been the type of thing to where they've created more questions than answers. And you're right, Ronaldo. I mean, the midichlorian thing, I think if they handled it a little bit differently, if they had just taken the explanation further, you might have had a situation where, yeah, people might not have had that much of an issue with it. I mean, why do you think that Lucas didn't do that? I mean, he obviously has a handle on what he was trying to do with it. Why do you think he kept it like that?
Well, because he's bad at dialogue. I mean, like I said earlier.
Right,
I mean,
yeah, exactly. It's kind of like,
that's
well,
why Lawrence,
you know.
that's why Lawrence Kasdan and all them had to punch up the dialogue for 5 because
Oh, yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
And that's the thing about George Lucas. He's a storyteller. He's not really the best director, so to speak. So when it comes to, and even who's it, Harrison Ford, he was like, yeah, you can read the stuff, but you can't say it, and that's one of those things that's like, when you have George Lucas at the helm, sometimes it doesn't come, he knows what he wants to say. It just didn't translate. His intent versus impact was just off. That's all. But I mean, essentially that's what he was trying to say. It just didn't come
I
out
know,
that
and
way.
that's the thing that always bothered me about it, is the fact that he obviously, I mean, that's what frustrates me a lot of times reading these interviews. And you can see that he so understands story.
Mhm.
And even a lot of things that he said, just in a little bit. I mean, again, if you guys want to explore this further, you can always get the actual encyclopedia thing that's, I think it's like 95 to 2005, something like that. And it really covers the prequels in depth, and it's this whole big interview. But there's also a ton of interviews online that, there's a lot of YouTube, because that's basically how this topic came to be, actually, is that I was just doing my usual thing, going down the YouTube rabbit hole like we all do. And essentially I came across this whole thing about something about like Lucas explains midichlorians or it's something. Whatever the title was, it actually caused me to click on it, which of course shows the importance of titles and thumbnails. But once I started watching this, it just kind of changed my mind a little bit. Like, I'm like, all right, it wasn't quite the dumb concept that I thought it was. Or it wasn't Lucas trying to make Star Wars more Star Trek. It really did make sense. But the problem is like you said, he just doesn't seem to have the ability to translate that on the page for actors to actually say this stuff. Where it could have been articulated in a way that I think the fans wouldn't have been so up in arms about it.
No, that's true. And the thing is, here's my question though. When we look at the sequel trilogy, and I know we don't like to, but
Yeah, well, we did. We did look at it in our What is Star Wars series. Would you guys go back? It's there. I mean, well, go ahead.
so when we talk about Rey,
Yeah.
like, okay, if we're saying like, okay, the midichlorians, okay, those are receptors, so people's ability, and but they have to still study and train. It's like, well, why was Rey so freaking powerful and she had no training?
Because she has female chromosomes. And in Kathleen Kennedy's world, if you're female, that
There
means
it
you're
is.
automatically powerful. That you don't
There,
even
there it
need
is.
midichlorians. You have Y chromosomes or whatever. I mean,
I, I'll drink to that one.
that's basically it. It's just, and again, to be fair, if you want to keep this in universe, I mean, they never really, it's not like anybody said, hey, Rey, let me just get that blood test going.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's like, because in the Force Awakens, she's all using mind,
I know. I know. Again, it
Like,
was stupid.
that's kind of an advanced thing.
It is.
Like,
And that's the problem that I had with the sequel trilogy more than anything, was the fact that, you know, it was almost like Kathleen Kennedy was kind of like, well, if Luke Skywalker did this, then my female version of Luke Skywalker has to be even better. So that's what ended up happening. And that was the problem. You know, she's using like the Jedi mind trick or something just like out the gate. I mean, now I get it that a lot of the apologists will start to say, well, you know, she's the new chosen one, right? And so the Force guided her and all this, and, you know, just kind of, I don't know, gave her the knowledge. And they'll also point to the fact that when she first tried it, she failed, right? But again, she got it on the second try. I mean, that's, like you said, that's an advanced Force power.
yeah. I mean, that's just, so that's what I'm saying. Like, and that's where Lucasfilm has to be very careful, is because if George has set things out in canon, you somewhat kind of are circumventing that a little bit, because now you're basically just like, oh, well, Rey can just do.
Well, the cheap way to
You
do it
know.
is just to say that she's got a midichlorian count of like 40,000 or something stupid.
But even still, I mean, that's like Anakin had a super. He had higher than Yoda, but the thing is,
20,000.
but he still had to be trained in it.
I know.
Don't see him as
I know.
You don't see him as a kid being like, "Oh, okay,
Exactly.
I'm about to go take on Darth Maul."
You know what? Because here's the thing that, well, here's
Like-
here's the argument that I get into people about this all the time. Well, at least when I feel like engaging. I mean, a lot of times it's just so stupid. I'm like, you know what? I'm not even talking to you about this. You obviously have no idea what you're saying. But here's the problem that I have. They'll start to come back with, well, but she's Palpatine's granddaughter or whatever. It's like, okay, let's just ride with that for a second. Here's a couple of things that you got to look at. Number one, she wouldn't have been Palpatine's granddaughter if Colin Trevorrow had just gone ahead and made his version, which would have been called Duel of the Fates. The original version was not to have Palpatine in it at all, i.e., no. I mean, I guess you could still cheese out and say she was Palpatine's granddaughter, even if you don't have them in the film. But I don't even think that was where they were going to go. So that's number one. But let's just deal with what is, right? Okay, so fine. She's Palpatine's granddaughter. Anakin was the child of the actual Force. You know, the Force itself conceived him, shoved him in Shmi's womb, and, you know, he was popped out at that point. And not even he, as you pointed out, had this innate ability to start doing stuff. Yes, he was a great pilot. Yes, he could build stuff. It was like he was using the Force more out of instinct than out of actual controlled usage. And that's where the difference came in. And that's the kind of storyteller that Lucas is versus Kathleen Kennedy shoving down the throats of the likes of J.J. Abrams and all these guys. Because remember, you know, a lot of times we like to go, well, you know, it's just these modern people at Lucasfilm or whatever. But don't forget, Lawrence Kasdan was the one that actually, well, I know he co-wrote Solo, and I think he actually co-wrote The Rise of Skywalker as well. Or his kid might have, Jason. But I know he was involved in there somewhere. So, you know, you did have some of the OG guys. But again, it's all about leadership and it's all about storytelling. Let's see what we got. We got David. So David's saying Rey's MIDI count, I like how we're just going to abbreviate, is 1 million. Eric went off on this topic. MNF MIDI count is 50,000. Andor's MIDI count is 9,000.
Oh, Fast and
Furious, yeah. And Daryl's MIDI count needs work. Yeah, I mean, again, you know, it just depends.
Not what your sister said.
So. If you cannot be turned. Well, here's the thing.
Nope, I can't.
Yeah, right? But the thing I think that, we could take away from all this. So again, we're up into 75-25. So 3/4 of you actually think the midichlorians are a good thing. And 25% of you basically say, yeah, no. And where I land on this whole thing, again, is I think that ultimately it's not bad, because one thing that we didn't talk about yet that I meant to bring up, even though they cheesed out and called it M count, is how they brought it up again in The Mandalorian. And they were talking about Grogu and how they more or less tested him, and they're getting some of his blood and all this other stuff, and that's how they're going to create this new, they're going to, I don't know, inject it into Gideon or something and create like some
he was trying
army.
to create this super, he was trying to start this whole super force.
Right, he wanted to start with him, but then he wanted to create that would have been what I would have thought of as Sith Trooper, by the way. I mean, if you're going to call something, again, I don't want to get off on a tangent on episode 9, but if you're going to call something a Sith Trooper, I kind of expect Sith-like powers. I don't just expect red armor. As cool as it was, I will say, it was cool armor. They were one of the coolest looking troopers in Star Wars. But again, if you're going to call it a Sith Trooper, the votes actually swung back up. So now 88% say that yes, 12% say no. All right, so most people are on board. I guess either they already kind of thought that, or maybe we're doing a good job persuading. I don't know. All right, so Ronaldo chimes in. Ronaldo says, do you think Dave will use them? It seems he doesn't like them. Well, you know what? Ooh, 90%. 90% say yes. That's crazy.
Well, with Filoni, though, I mean, I don't know. It depends, because, I mean, like we always keep saying, he's the heir apparent to George, and but I mean, and they've used him, like I said, they've used it in Mandalorian, and he's on Mandalorian, so can't really say that. They still use it. It's just
they do.
I think it's kind of like
But again, do you think this is a good? So I guess, because again, I want to go on record here, if I have already, but I just want to reiterate this statement, is that I went from my personal midichlorian journey, let's put it like that, right? Went from, okay,
this on TLC.
I know, I do. I mean, this is kind of like the Lifetime Network. They're going to make a movie out of this, how I accepted midichlorians. But pretty much, I went from being vehemently against the whole thing, okay? So I hated midichlorians, to once I started thinking about Lucas's, well, first of all, the interview that he gave and just his explanation of it and everything, I'm like, okay, well, I have to admit, this makes total sense. All right, but then once I started to frame it within the actual prequels and then the original trilogy, and then more importantly, even the Mandalorian and like that time period. We won't go to the sequel trilogy because we just don't want to. But that's where, as you pointed out with Filoni, that's where they're really dealing with them. That's where they're actually saying, look, these are, actual evidence that they're continuing on with the midichlorian thing with Grogu and the M count and all that stuff. When you factor all that in, you got to admit, I mean, it does add context and add a little bit of, it kind of enriches the story a little bit. And so I don't have a problem with them being there now. The question that I've just always tried to figure out here, though, is, did we really need them? In other words, if you remove the midichlorian thing completely, does Star Wars lose anything? That's how you have to ask it for yourself. When I say something like, do they need to be there or whatever, yeah, I get it, sci-fi fantasy, you're just trying to... But you have to ask yourself, if you want to define if something really needs to be in the story, what that actually means is, if you take it out, does Star Wars lose anything? Now, while you're weighing that, understand too that I'm not talking about enriching, because midichlorians, hands down, I think enrich the storyline. And that might actually say, well, maybe they need to be there because to the degree in which they do enrich the storyline, Star Wars would be missing a lot. But those are the kinds of questions that I was trying to get to with tonight's discussion. If you removed it, and you guys watching live, there's a good amount of you watching live right now. If you guys weigh in, maybe put it in the comment section if you guys are, watching afterwards. While you're all hitting that like button, while you're hitting the like button right now, ask yourself and chat in. Would Star Wars be missing anything? Would it lose anything if they removed the midichlorian thing?
I would say no. It's not needed. Like if you took the midichlorian thing out, Star Wars, because you still have the explanation that Obi-Wan and Yoda provided us about the Force. I mean, and you can keep it just extremely mystical. I think a lot of people had issues with it because they felt like it revealed more, but I don't think it really necessarily revealed more. But I can understand why they may think that, because they want to keep the Force almost kind of how Michael Myers is. Like, like, why does he kill?
Right.
This is like, okay, well, he's just pure evil. That's why you can't kill him. That's why you can't, because he's like evil personified. That's what Loomis kept saying. Like, he's the embodiment of evil. And, so that's what made Michael so terrifying because, unlike Freddy, he had a backstory. I mean, Michael does kind of have a backstory, but I mean, more so why he kills.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
And that's the thing. It's like no one knows why he continues to kill and why he's like Freddy. Why?
Well, but here's the thing, and I'm glad you brought this up because they did explain it, and that's when people had a problem with it. When you just had you had a few levels of explanation when it came to Michael, and then I'll get to some of these chats. So hold on, guys. So the original Halloween was scary. Because you didn't know who he was. He had no motive. He wasn't some supernatural guy or anything like that. He was just this relentless shape, as they called him. He wasn't, I mean, they didn't even really sometimes they referred to him as Michael, but most of the time it was the boogeyman or whatever, right? He was kind of evil personified. And that's what made him terrifying. The first level of explanation that you got was in Halloween 2. When they said, oh, well, he killed his sister back in 1963. Now he's coming after his other one because Laurie Strode's actually Michael's sister. Okay, that chipped away a little bit at the mystique of Michael Myers. Because now it almost turned him into this like half revenge killer in a way, right? Then, with what they call the Thorn trilogy, which is Halloween's 4, 5, and 6... that's when they tried to make it to where, yes, Michael was part of this druid cult, and whenever the thorn, thing, and he had the symbol on his hand, and it was like, they went into this whole convoluted thing, and this is exactly why I think people reject when they tried to take something that's a bit esoteric and surreal and just kind of, just pretty much vague, but it gives us the knowledge that we need in order to enjoy the story. If you try to explain that too much, you run the risk of ruining it because you're overdoing it. And that's where it's kind of like, okay, now you're just taking all the the story isn't served. Does anybody really need to know why it all works? I mean, I understand what Jordan... Now, if you want to do that as sort of an outline and say, hey, let's figure this out as storytellers. Because if you understand as a storyteller how the Force works, well, then you can craft different stories and you can do it a little bit more intelligently. But we, the audience, don't necessarily need to know. But again... and this is where it sounds like I'm flip-flopping a little bit, but that's why I say it doesn't really take anything away, right? But if you do put it in there, my thing would be, as long as you didn't go too crazy with it.
Yeah.
It adds a nice context, it enriches, and it gives you some additional stories like this whole Grogu.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I think. You guys, wow, 92% of you think yes. 8% of you think, nah, it shouldn't be there. So, all I can say is, where were you guys back in the, back when this is a thing? But you know what?
Well, that's because we didn't have George's explanation back then.
Well, yeah, maybe that's it. Well, and I did, by the way, if you guys are interested in actually seeing the video where we got this from, normally I would just say, oh, we'll put the link in the description, or, you just search YouTube or whatever. Oh, and I got to get to all these chats too. But you guys could just go to our Discord, discord.gg/headtoheadsw. And of course, that link is in the description. You go to the Discord. The Discord is going to be sort of our hub, right? You could talk to us there. There's a bunch of forums that you can participate in there with all different subjects, beyond Star Wars even. That's where the people who do the Buy Me a Coffee thing, they have their own little thing that's part of what this is all about. You can be a Padawan, Jedi Knight, Jedi Master. You can donate some money, help the cause. You can even make one-time donations. But we actually have spots for you on our Discord, like little channels for you guys in there. And there'll be some special stuff there. And of course, again, just hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button helps out. But in the Discord right now, I actually have the video is in there. The link to the video is in there. So you guys can go and check it out. And I encourage you to check it out for yourselves, because it really is fascinating when you basically hear George telling this in his own words, what he was trying to do and what he was trying to achieve. It makes sense. And that was really what it came down to for me. Does it make sense? Because at the time that I was really downright adversarial about this, I just didn't think it made sense. I was really against them. Like, oh man, they're trying to, do this and ruin Star Wars. And, I wasn't doing the whole George Lucas is ruining my childhood thing, although plenty of people were doing that. Okay. So first, and Daryl, this one's for you. Look at that. That's so nice. All right. So Ronaldo goes, I mean, they kind of use them, but I mean, as a main story point, like George wanted. Yeah, I mean, he goes on to say, I think it'd be cool if they use them, but if they don't, Star Wars is still the same. Basically, it's okay if they do, and it's okay if they don't. And then David goes on to say, hey, look, Star Wars won't lose anything without it. We already understood the Force. It's one of those things that only matter to nerds when they need material for their podcast reviews. Well, guess what? We're getting them tonight, buddy. But but again, I think that these are the kinds of things that are important to discuss. I mean, especially if you're a Star Wars discussion show, because the midichlorian thing really was, in my mind, the gateway to taking Star Wars from more of a sci-fi fantasy and then swinging it to fantasy sci-fi. I mean, that sounds like semantics, but it really isn't. You have to be very careful if you're going to preserve Star Wars. And that's what makes me nervous about Kathleen Kennedy all the time. That's the reason why I really hope that she's serious this time about not renewing her contract, because she clearly doesn't understand Star Wars. There's even been rumors that Lucas might, take it back, or at least try to assert some control. And of course, Filoni and Favreau, hopefully they continue to do stuff. So, I don't know. I think ultimately, you guys obviously are on board with the midichlorian thing, and I think that that's cool. David says, comment wasn't about you all. You all are all legends, pun intended. Well, we were the old expanded universe. We are now legends. But no, you're right. I mean, I understand what you're saying about the whole nerd thing, because look, we are the first, even on Twitch, we actually brand this as Star Wars discussion for normal people. That's basically how we brand this on Twitch, because, we want to be clear that we're not the typical Star Wars show, actually. We're quite a bit different. I mean, just the way that we discuss it, the topics that we discuss, even when we discuss the same topics as a lot of these other Star Wars shows, we do it differently. We do it a little bit less. You don't necessarily have to be a Star Wars nerd to enjoy our show, but it probably helps. All right. So with that, I think, we're getting close to wrapping this thing up. But again, let us know. You guys still have about 20 or 30 seconds left in the chat to say whatever. The poll again, 92% yes, midichlorians are a good thing, and 8% no, they're not. So overwhelmingly, you guys at least watching right now thought midichlorians were cool. Where I stand, midichlorians are not exactly the demons that I thought they were when I first saw The Phantom Menace, and because they're really not mentioned after that, honestly. It was just that one little section in The Phantom Menace, which is another reason, by the way, why I think it doesn't bother me that much, is because they didn't really harp on that. Like, they didn't make it a key part of the whole Star Wars thing. It was just this one quick explanation, and that's it. So, I'm on board with it. You can get some more stories out of it. I just hope that they don't take it too much in a sci-fi direction, and I hope it doesn't become a key component of Star Wars moving forward. What are your final thoughts on this whole thing?
Yeah, I think for me, midichlorians, I pretty much got it. When they explained it in the movie, maybe a little bit differently, slightly, but more or less, I got it. Is it necessary? No. Is it cool that that he's explained it? Yeah, I think it clarifies some things, and it still allows it to be a mystical thing, and I think that's what fans really want, is to keep that air um, of mystery in Star Wars, and that's kind of why we go to the theaters to watch it. So,
Well, Peter's asking us. He says, "Hey, did you notice anything new in the Ahsoka TV ad?" No, but I didn't see the one. Oh, they had like another one. They keep saying that these are all the final ads, right? Like you keep saying, whatever. So they had one that they called the final ad. Then they came out with another one that they titled Anakin that was supposed to be a final ad. But then again, sometimes it's hard to tell which ones are the fan fiction ones, were like a fan-made person, especially now. I mean, before when they were making all these fan-made trailers before anything was official out, it was fairly easy to spot those. But now that there is enough legitimate footage out there that people could snag and try to edit in their own way and sneak in video game footage here and there, right? It's a little harder to tell. So, no, I did not notice anything new. I mean, did you?
I just saw one. I just saw a new one, and it was cool. It didn't. I mean, of course, they kept showing the world between worlds thing, um, in the background, and then they had those two. Oh, they had Sabine fighting with a lightsaber. So I don't know if that's to what he's referencing, but
well, he popped in. So, but before I get Peter's chat, and then David has one too. Before I get those chats up, this would be a good time since we're talking about Ahsoka. So for like the next 5 shows or so, right? Today we had was George Lucas right about midichlorians? But if you go to our Discord and even like in our YouTube community, we actually have a list. The last 2 episodes in this like 5-episode chunk is Journey to Ahsoka 1 and Journey to Ahsoka 2. So we're going to talk about various aspects of Ahsoka, and we're pretty much going to prep, I guess that's the idea, right? You're the one that came up with these.
Yes, we're going to pretty much prep you.
Yes, you're the one that should probably explain this.
Yeah, the last 2 episodes that's leading up to the release of the premiere of Ahsoka, the 2 episodes that are going to be released. Essentially, we're just going to kind of talk about the journey of Ahsoka as far as her as a character, different plot points that she's had in the animated series leading up to her being revealed in The Mandalorian and
now
Book of
having her
Boba
own
Fett,
series.
and now having her own series.
Okay, that's fair. David says, I can't wait for Andor Season 2. I bet you all it's going to be worse than the first season. If it's good, I'll buy both of you a coffee and make my wife buy a master subscription. Ooh. Well, unlike David, if you guys want to buy the Jedi Master subscription for $25 a month, the Andor doesn't have to be terrible. However, I happen to think it's going to be good. And David, I hate to say it, but I think your wife might be buying us a Master subscription, because I actually think that 2 is going to be better than 1, because I think they're going to add more elements of Rogue One into it. You're going to see K2SO. I know that for a fact. You're going to see, because they're going to do a bunch of time jumping in season 2. I know that. Like, it's going to be various, I don't know, like time skips from episode to episode. Some episode might be a few months, some might be a few years. It's not going to be as linear as the first one was. So I don't know. So Peter actually is telling us now what he noticed. He said, I noticed the green magic under Morgan's hand opening up the cosmic map. Witch or Night Sister? That's, there's been rumors, a lot of rumors actually, that they're going to bring in the Night Sisters. Witches. Yeah, or the Dathomir Witches, one of them. Because the Night Sisters were a little bit, I think they did make their way into canon, like in the Clone Wars or something like that, but I know they were a big expanded universe thing. The Dathomir Witches were actually sort of based on the Night Sisters from the old expanded universe, which is interesting. And then Ronaldo says, correct me if I'm wrong, but Andor finished filming before the writer's strike? Well, maybe. I think so. Because the idea is that Andor is supposed to premiere sometime in 2024. I don't know if they actually gave us any kind of a date, though, like any kind of a month or whatever. Do you remember? I know we did a show. Well, we actually did a couple of shows. One, we did this whole show on everything that was coming up this year or last year or something, and it ended up being all wrong because, Kathleen Kennedy. And then we did another one that's basically been tracking. Like, it's been pretty cool. So I think it's going to be in the summer or fall, right? Or did you find out?
Says 2024. Filming for the second semester on the 1st of 22 and was not affected by the GA strike in 23. As the scripts are the completed principal photography is wrapped up by this month. Of this year, I'm sorry.
All right, because that might have been referring to just the writer's strike, but once the actors all went on strike, though, that's what I think where the thing is. Yeah, I know it was written before the writer's strike, but now that the actors are on strike...
Well, that's what I said. Principal photography has already been completed.
Is it? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, it depends
it's expected to wrap up at least this month.
See, and that's the thing. Because well, we hope. David says almost every series in general gets worse over time. Visions will be better than Andor 2. Those are fighting words, man.
Yeah, I'm just going to hit log off right now.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's like always. You're just gone. Like I didn't even say the thing yet. Peter says, exactly. I want to see Merrin go head-to-head versus Morgan. Battle of the Last Night Sisters. That would actually be kind of cool. This actually reminds me of how many really cool characters that we've had in the expanded universe that they could actually bring back. Just this whole general discussion that we've had, even with the midichlorians and stuff. I don't know. My mind has been wandering into some of the concepts that the expanded universe came up with. And it's just, that's why I think it's so disappointing that Disney didn't just make Timothy Zahn's novels, episode 7, 8, and 9. So, Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, Last Command. And then just, even if you wanted to mess it up and do your own 7, 8, and 9, fine. But I think what would have been beneficial, though, is if they have taken some of the other stuff. Now, if you guys missed, when fortunately, Daryl wasn't with me last Friday, but it was just me. I actually went into this whole thing about how the Yuuzhan Vong should be coming back in that Rey movie, that Dawn of the Jedi, not Dawn of the Jedi, whatever the Rey movie is going to be called. Because the Dawn of the Jedi is a Mangold movie.
Mm-hmm.
But the Rey movie that takes place like 15 years after the Rise of Skywalker, that one, if they brought in the Yuuzhan Vong, that would just be, I think, really, really cool. And that's just one example of what they could do. But if you missed it, that was actually a good discussion with you guys. We went on for quite some time, and you guys were really good in the chats. That was a really, I mean, I think all our shows are pretty good. But I mean, that one is just like really stellar. So that was the one last Friday, if you guys want to check that out. Not yet, though. We're not done. Ronaldo says, Visions is the best cinematic experience ever created. Francis Ford Coppola, 2023. He didn't say that.
All right, man. Well, it's been cool. Thank you guys for
yeah, exactly.
joining us.
Right. Exactly.
I don't know about you, but I got to get out of here.
Exactly. Like, man, you know what? I forgot all about that dentist appointment that I've had for, a while
I gotta
now.
go walk my goldfish.
Well, that would probably be more enjoyable to you than watching another episode of Visions at the moment. But as always, you know what, guys? It's always a lot of fun talking to you guys. I'm glad that you guys chat in and that you enjoy it. And to everybody that watches, really, even the people that aren't actively chatting in, there's a lot of you that watch. There's a lot of you that watch after we're done going live. You watch it throughout the week, and there's a lot of views, and you guys give us a lot of likes and a lot of support. I should have done this at the beginning, but I want to welcome all the new subscribers. We got a gang of new subscribers over the last few weeks, and we keep getting more, and we hope that continues. And you guys can help us out with that. Share it with your friends, put it on your social media. I don't know. Tell everybody about it, because the more people we get chatting in, the more fun it is. And I also want to, again, thank our viewers on Twitch, because we hadn't really gone live on Twitch in a long time. And we've been doing it for the last few weeks now. We already have some followers on Twitch. Of course, Bruce, he's with us on Twitch over there. So we appreciate that. And again, we actually, you probably had the list in front of you, right? I have it. I want to talk about what we're going to be talking about Monday.
A top 5 favorite Jedi.
Oh, all right. Well, there you go. Our top 5 favorite Jedi. That's what we're going to be doing on Monday. So I want you guys to think about your top 5 favorite Jedi, and then chat it in, compare it with what we're thinking. That's going to be a fun show, because I'm sure that's going to be a lot up for debate too. All right, so I think with that, it's time to wrap it up. Again, it's been another fun Friday night talking Star Wars with you guys. Join us again Monday night at 8 o'clock. We're going to be doing it all over again. And until then, we will see you guys on our Discord server, because again, I pop in there almost every night. So I might be on there later tonight. So you guys can join me there. So with that, I'm Eric Vansel.
I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.